What was the question?
Well, I haven't had your classes on Revelations. No, that would have been applied to this, never mind. What I want to know, does Passover the planet, they saw these signs that caused the fire, the pillar of fire. Now, was that affected that do all the plagues of Egypt? Was it part of that sea? Was all that part of this time?
All of it.
In your research, you figured out how that, I mean, do you know, okay, because of this effect of a planet passing caused, what's the things that happen in those things?
Well, caused the parting of the waters.
Locusts, well, yeah, but.
Locusts,
The
electromagnetic effects heated the ground and accelerated the gestation period of insects, even things up, even the frogs. And so they multiply. It even happens in the Middle East today. You get a hot east wind, they call it a shirako. And when it blows over the desert, it changes the charge. And the locusts come out of the ground like nothing else, and you have a plague. It even happens today. But in a planetary event, it's accentuated 1,000 times, maybe more.
Now you've compared and contrasted the two planetary events, that associated with the Exodus and that associated with the Second Coming, presumably. Right. But there are others in between. For example, at the birth of Christ, natural catastrophes, phenomenon that took place at that time.
Exactly.
Is that attributable to a planetary event of some sort?
In my mind, that's the only thing that could cause the extreme account that we have in the Book of Mormon. Thank goodness for Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. Clarifies so many things. What the Old Testament talks about is darkness and an earthquake and I don't know what else at the time of Christ's crucifixion. Over in the New World, they were having a really tough time with it. Cities were sinking into the earth and buried under the ocean. Other chunks of land were raised up. The whole face of the earth changed. That's not just an ordinary geological event in my mind. In my mind, that requires an external causative agent. Something exerted a tremendous amount of force on the earth. Electromagnetic effects are 1,000,000 billion, it sounds like Carl Sagan, billion times greater than gravity. Gravity is a weak force. Electromagnetic power is extreme if you can accept it. Our whole planet, all the planets in our solar system were sculpted by these electromagnetic forces. It's not erosion over millions of years that carved the Grand Canyon. It's an electrical discharge that excavated the material out of that canyon in the matter of a few hours.
Well, if you just look at Mars, the canyons in Mars look a lot like the Grand Canyon. Or if they do these electrical experiments, that looks more like the Grand Canyon than this gradual, I don't know what word they use, but gradually, the water just gradually taking one little sand out at a time. I've been to the Grand Canyon. It's not gradual. I don't know. Most people don't want to look over because it's so drastically down. And with all the little crevices off to the side of it too.
Go ahead, Alan.
But all natural phenomena are not associated with catastrophism of some sort.
No.
I mean, there are internal forces.
In between.
Gradual forces.
This is why it says in
erosion, etc.
This is why it says in Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord tells the church through Joseph Smith, he says, I'm going to take away, I'm going to change the times and the seasons. How do you do that? Just think about it for a minute. You have to alter the declination of the earth's axis to the sun to change that. In fact, we have an account in the Old Testament when that happened. In the days of Ahaz, the sundial went down by 10 degrees. And then in the days of his grandfather, I think it was Hezekiah, It came back by 10 degrees. How is that done? Or was they just imagining things? No, Joseph Smith is on record by the Brown family. Patriarch Brown years ago published this. His grandfather, I think it was Benjamin Brown, and his wife were sitting down to dinner one evening in Nauvoo, and there's a knock on the door. Open the door, and there's Joseph Smith. Will you hide me? The mob's after me. Sure. They brought him in and they fed him, and he says, I see you're reading the 133rd section. Let me tell you something about that. And he goes out on record and shows him the constellation of the Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, and takes him in and reads from the 133rd section and says, when the planet that comes towards the Earth in the future, when it does that, it'll cause the Earth to spin slower, and the water at the equators will move. At the equator will move to the poles. And he gave the example of swinging a bucket of water over your head. If you keep the bucket swinging, the water stays in the bucket. But if you slow it down, the water comes out. And he said the same thing will happen to our planet. Joseph understood these. Now this is, I know LDS scholars say, well, that stuff is anecdotal. Okay. But Joseph made many such statements. And they ignore them all because it doesn't fit in the context of the given planetary history of our Earth. And yet here's a prophet, Joseph Smith, saying, yeah, these things happen. And he's explaining. So, yes, if I had a couple, 3 hours, I could sit down with you and show you how each of the Exodus phenomena can be directly the result of electromagnetic effects. But it takes time. That's why my online course is 16 hours of instruction. It's like taking a college course. You don't have to be a prophet to read the scriptural imagery that the prophets used. You just have to have the same training.
At times, though, it almost sounds like the natural is driving the spiritual rather than vice versa.
Well,
in other words,
that's just me.
The Lord's telling Moses what he's telling him because he knows what nature's going to provide, as opposed to him being the author.
Well, he's
whatever's
still
going to happen.
He's still the architect. He's still the one that creates that. Forgive me, but I do overbalance the other way because I see it so lopsided that I'm trying to even things out. And I don't mean to overstate my case. My wife constantly reminds me that I'm putting myself in jeopardy.
And that's why I asked,
good question.
Finding the balance between the two.
I think an example of that would be in the Doctrine and Covenants, and I can't remember that section where it says, I've started it in motion. And this would be like,
in the 84th section maybe you're talking about. The Lord, I wrote a piece about this called the Forgotten Commandment. In the 84th section, the Lord told whoever was the presiding bishop at the time, and I can't remember his name, that he was to go on a mission to the East Coast and warn them of the desolation of abomination that was going to happen. And then he said, and now the rest of you, my brethren, do the same thing. Well, that means the priesthood, right? Yeah, right. He said, learn, teach yourselves, learn, how did he, I'm trying to remember, I don't want to misstate it. The idea is that every elder in the church, elder, high priest, whatever, should understand what the desolation of abomination is and be able to teach it. And this is a quote from Doctrine and Covenants. The Lord's words, clearly and understandingly. And
I was thinking of a different scripture.
Were you?
He was talking where he said he actually...
Well, I was getting to that.
Oh, okay. Go
At the very end of the 84th section, he says, you can't see it yet, but I have set my hand to change the starry heavens.
One way you might think about it, like NASA, they build these rockets, right? They're using science and natural law and whatnot. But still, there's someone there in the cockpit, or probably not the cockpit, but the station, Houston, going to push the green button for the countdown to start and go. In one sense, maybe God pushes the planet with that button somehow to get it started going here, but then he lets it go happen all by itself after he starts it. Kind of, I don't remember the phrase that Anthony said, but he said he set his hand to start it or something to that effect.
I am of the opinion that, and again, this is just my opinion, don't want anybody thinking I'm trying to change doctrine, that every world that has ever been created was created in an electrical phenomenon that is well known to plasma physicists and electrical engineers today. It's called a plasma pinch. And that means that there's a group of 7 to 9 orbs are created in this electrical column, in this huge interconnected electrical circuit that we call a galaxy. And every world was created the same way, so that every world has seen these same things in the heavens, has experienced the same thing. I don't know how to relate this to Latter-day Saints except to say the missionaries don't use different lessons when they go out teaching the gospel. They use the same lesson. And they say it the same way over.
We're through it.
Sorry. And they say it the same way over and over and over again. You don't deviate hardly at all. When Moroni came to Joseph Smith, the same thing, 4 times, 3 in the night and once the next day, he gave him exactly the same message. I believe all the prophets saw the same vision. Ezekiel, Daniel, Joel, John in
Levi,
Revelation,
Nephi,
they all saw the same vision. They just reported the part that seemed germane to their situation and the people they were teaching.
Or the part that they related to the most.
The part they related to the
Could be
most.
lots of reasons.
And our world is not a one-of-a-kind knockoff. It is one of billions and billions of worlds that have come into existence. The gods do it the same way. Our Father did it the same way His Father did it. And all the planets that have ever come into creation have seen these things happen in the heavens. It was all planned before we ever came here, Alan. And that's the reason. That's why I see it as a system that works, and there's no inclination to change it. It always happens the same way. So, God, who knows the end from the beginning, knew when the Exodus was going to happen, knew when His Son was going to come to the earth and be crucified, knew when the gospel would be restored in Joseph's day, and knows when these latter-day events will happen. But we're not privy to that information except in retrospect.
Yeah, I just in parting, and that's me.
You got to leave.
You can stay as long as you want.
Understand.
You left me with a blank spot too midway through when you were talking about Moses and our mistaken impression that he was exercising priesthood in the things that he was doing.
I maybe overstated a little bit there.
Sometimes you're going to have to explain to me your take on priesthood power.
On priesthood power.
And where that interfaces with
my take on priesthood power is the same as Brigham Young. He said it's an onerous duty. Brigham Young said it. Don't blame me. Brigham said it.
Onerous duty?
Onerous duty. It's service. That's what priesthood is. It's service.
What makes that onerous?
Because it takes up so much time and effort, I guess. We're weak, maybe.
A weighty responsibility?
A weighty responsibility. And yes, we have to have priesthood in order to exercise certain offices in the priesthood and do certain things. But that's a matter of authority. None of us is going to go out and part
Yeah.
the Red Sea today.
And I was gonna say, I was assuming maybe that was your distinction. You were looking at priesthood as an issue of authority rather than an issue of power in some natural sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for
Thank you.
coming.
Well,
Appreciate
I
it.
got a question.
Okay.
Talking about Moses and, you know, the water, especially the Red Sea, it makes me think of how, and I don't know if this is Mormon lore or actual history, but where Joseph Smith hit the ground and water came up. Is that just lore or is that real history?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay.
Don't know. Thanks for coming. There's so much I don't know, Steve.
Oh, that's
What I
fine.
do know is just a little, and I get way excited about it, but, and like he said, I kind of overstate my case sometimes.
I think also that as time goes on, and the more you get into this, the meshing will become even more stronger between the natural and the spiritual.
Yeah.
To where there might not be a distinction. You may not be able to draw a distinctive. I mean, we can now.
No, that's very perceptive. That's very perceptive. There really isn't a distinction. It's artificial. They're two parts of the same thing.
And it says that in Dr. Covenant somewhere that you can't have the spiritual without the temporal.
Or the
both.
temporal without the
temporal
spiritual.
right? And
I
I
mean,
think it's just like our spiritual body without our physical body. We have to have both to be like our Heavenly Father.
And he has,
Right.
he has a temple, I mean, a
But it,
physical,
yeah.
not temple, but he has a physical body.
As a physical body, that is a temporal truth.
Yeah.
Why does that?
Well, I think they're trying to tell us to go home.
Well,
But,
we still have 20 more minutes, so I don't know.
Oh, do we? Somebody's determined to have us leave.
Well, I got the air conditioning going, I think that was part of it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them, otherwise we'll.
Well, I'd be interested in is your explanation of the water in the Red Sea, if it goes with
Sure.
the subject. Exodus.
It goes unacknowledged that the tides that we have on the earth today are really electromagnetic effects and not gravitation. I don't know how much you know about tides, but there's a primary tide that is on the same side as the moon. And that means that has led scientists to say, well, it's the gravitational pull that causes the high tide. The water follows the moon as the earth turns beneath it. What they don't tell you is very often is there's a reflexive tide on exactly the same opposite side of the earth from the primary tide. Primary tide, reflexive tide. That's why there's a high tide twice a day. If you were raised in a port city, you would know that. There's a high tide twice a day. One is higher than the other. One is called, I've forgotten the term, a neap tide, and I don't remember the other term. But they're reflexive, they're electromagnetic effects. So in this planetary encounter that I talked about, what would you expect the water of the earth to do? It would build up in these huge tidal bulges.
Okay.
All the water would be drawn, and it says in the Old Testament, it does say that they saw the waters parted, and it stood up as a wall on either side, but it also says later that the waters were piled up as a heap. They could see it on the horizon. The water evacuated out of the Red Sea, out of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is actually where they crossed, in my opinion. And it dried. It wasn't the wind that dried the land. Sure, there was a wind. The air is evacuating, creating a tidal bulge in our atmosphere, just like the water is creating a tidal bulge.
Just like Joseph Smith's example.
Right. We have the lithosphere, the rocky component of the planet. We have the hydrosphere and we have the atmosphere. All three react to this electromagnetic pull. And so, yes, there was an east wind all night, but it was literally pulling the water out of the seabed, drying up the sand in front of them. So when they walked across, it was dry land. And that's another indication that there's something more going on in the story than is obvious on the face of it.
That makes sense.
And the interesting thing is there's a auspicious location on the shore of on the eastern shore of the Sinai, on the Gulf of Aqaba, which is between Sinai and Saudi Arabia. There's a wadi that leads right down to the seashore, and there's a broad beach where there's no beach anywhere else. And if you were to remove the water, the topography is, it's only 80, 100 feet of water deep. There's a natural land bridge right there. If you evacuated the water, you would just, it says they could see the foundations of the earth. When they rose up in the morning, they could see the Gulf of Aqaba on both sides of this land bridge is about 1,000-foot drop, almost straight down, steep canyon wall. Couldn't get carts, couldn't get people down there and back up in a few hours in a million years. But at this land bridge, they could walk across and be on the other side in a couple hours.
Yeah, and they were there, just perfect timing. I think they were led.
And that's a good point. That would be the spiritual side that Alan was talking about. The Lord informs it's the prophet is guided by revelation. He knows where to be at what time in order to. That's why we're told, follow the prophet. It's kind of tough when he says, I want you to walk down into this former ocean bed and you'll come up on the other side. And they, what?
Yeah.
But they did it, and we look at the Israelites and say, well, why did they give Moses such a bad time? Didn't they know he was a prophet? In a world that is turned upside down and chaotic and nothing is happening the way it has happened your whole life, the sun doesn't come up and go down the same way. Stones are falling out of the sky. The water turns to this red poison. Animals are dying. People are dying. Everything's turned upside down. And then Moses says, okay, walk through this old seabed here. What?
Crazy?
You can begin to understand their reticence. You can begin to understand why they wanted to worship the golden calf, why they persuaded Aaron to do it, and Aaron consented. He wasn't a bad guy. What's that?
The red poison, the red wall.
The red water?
From Passover.
It's the same thing as the stones falling out of the sky. The first thing that comes out is this fine ferruginous dust, iron, like iron oxide. When it hits the water, it turns it red, turns it a ruddy color, and it makes it poisonous. That's another fascinating thing. Prophets in the last days, and they're never named, their visions in a couple of places were recorded in the early church magazine. I think it was called The Contributor. And they see the waters, and they said that it's turned putrid as the blood of a dead man. Well, that's why the Egyptians called it, or Moses called it, the water turned to blood. It poisons the water. You can't drink it. They had to dig wells to try to get water. They couldn't drink out of the river anymore. All electrical phenomena.
The stones falling and all that happening. Was a electric discharge that was doing excavating of the surfaces that was at the time. Did they see that? Like lightning?
Somewhere on the earth, an electrical discharge was making a Grand Canyon.
Yeah, pulling it all up.
Tossing the material miles high in the, some of it even reached escape velocity and flew off into space. The rest of it followed this long trajectory, this big arc, and fell in Egypt and into this warehouse. And first thing that they get is this fine dust. This electric arc machining is a result of ions and electrons rushing to a touchdown point and then leaping skyward towards the approaching planet, because the two are the two terminuses in an electrical current between them. And so these electrons are rushing. It's like wind and water. It does a tremendous amount of erosion, and it tears away the soil and digs these huge craters. All the craters that we see on moons in the solar system, in our solar system, are nice round circular things. You don't see meteorites hitting the ground. They gouge the ground. They seldom produce these nice circular craters. But electric discharge is just like a dust devil, like a hurricane. It spins, and it spins in one place, and it's machining the stuff away. And when it quenches and goes away, it leaves this nice circular crater like the one in Arizona. Meteor, they call it meteor crater. Bad misnomer. But
They found a meteor at the bottom of that, but they got part of it. What's the iron?
it's just whatever material
They have an iron piece they pulled out of the bottom of that thing, though.
they found small chunks.
Yeah,
They
they got something there on display.
They were,
in there.
oh yeah, they were working, they thought they'd find a meteorite that was made of solid iron. That's why they never did. All they found were chunks.
It's like this big. Yeah. It's like there's.
I know, I've been there.
That's it, but.
They were gonna get rich mining rich iron ore out of that crater. And they had to give up because there was no meteorite to be found. For years, they said it was a geologic event, some kind of a volcanic event that created that crater. Then along came Gene Shoemaker, the astronomer, and he said, no, those are impacts. So now they rushed out to Meteor Crater in Nevada and changed all the language and all the labels. Now it's an impact. Someday in the future, they'll rush out and change them and say, these were electrical discharges. The same thing that created the Grand Canyon a few miles up the road. This was just a secondary discharge. Stayed in one place, created that nice crater. The ones that didn't, the ones that migrate across the terrain, meander, and they create these deep canyons. Death Valley. Of course, the Grand Canyon, the Laurentian Deep under the ocean, the Great African Rift. These are not just chunks of continents slipping by one another, creating rifts, creating, what's the word for it?
Tectonic?
No, well, tectonic motion, but the crack is called a fault, creating faults. Sorry, now recall's a problem. These are chasms that were opened up by electrical discharge machine. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by electrical discharge machine. It cut the Great African Rift. Right down the valley where the Sea of Galilee empties into the Dead Sea, carved all of that, and it went right on into Africa and carved this huge canyon.
Also right down through the Dead Sea, down through that area, that.
Down into North
little stuff
Africa.
that destroyed.
Yep.
The Sodom and Gomorrah is right in that area.
Yeah, they're right, well,
They
supposedly. we
had
don't know
stones
for sure.
falling down on them too.
Yep.
Fire and brimstone.
Fire and
Come
brimstone.
from that.
Yep.
Destroyed it.
That the King James translators would have been very well advised to have used the word fire and brimstone instead of hailstone.
They use hailstone there too?
Well, not there, and I mean in the Exodus.
Oh, in Exodus, yeah. Did they use brimstone in the Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
Brimstone is just another word that they substituted. That was far enough back in history, they weren't too worried about labeling it correctly,
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know.
They argue today if it really even happened, huh? Unfortunately.
Well, thanks, folks. I'm about done. How about you? I was supposed to turn this on and.
Oh, yeah, do your demonstration. In fact, maybe turn the light off and do your
Yeah, they're doing
demonstration.
it for us. might as well.
Hey, are all your things gonna be here?
I don't
I don't
know.
know, it depends on what rooms I.
What-
How convenient for you?
Yeah, this is pretty convenient for me. I just live up the road a block or two.
Oh, I just lived down the road a block or two.
Good for you.
So anyway.
Well, we'll keep that in mind.
Okay, have a good one, guys.
Thanks, you too. Here's Here's what it looks like. I don't know if the camera can see it, but
A little higher maybe.
Yeah,
a
probably.
little higher. There's your, I'm trying to get it to, there's your burning bush. And they describe these things as, dendritic, which dendrites is really a biological term. It's how a tree grows. It branches out. The tree structure is dendritic. So that's why the description of a burning bush, it's a metaphor, but it's very indicative of what the thing looked like.
It makes sense. It's almost like electricity or lightning hitting the ground and, you know, looking for a ground to hit, right? The mountain's higher up and it's gonna
Exactly. What's
provide
the
that.
conditions that causes these signals fires now? And that they
The same thing, the earth is still discharging.
just the atmosphere has to put up there.
See, here's
energy
the,
up there.
here's the big lie in meteorology. Agitated particles in the atmosphere, wind create friction, creates a charge, and the charge is different from the charge in the ground, so lightning strikes. Lightning goes from the earth. The earth is constantly absorbing electrical energy from the solar wind. The solar wind is described as accelerated moving particles, ions and electrons. Moving ions and electrons is the very definition of an electric current. But modern astronomers do not want that association made, so they use meteorological terms. They say it's the solar wind. The earth is immersed in this current constantly flowing from the sun. The sun is connected to the center of our galaxy via these dark currents in space. You can't see them, just like you can't see the wires here, but they are huge, much larger than our sun. And the sun receives its energy from the center of the galaxy, and it lights our sun. The sun acts exactly like the transformer on the power pole of your home. It steps the energy down so that the planets around it can use it without destroying all life. Steps the energy down and is constantly feeding via the solar wind that energy into the earth. And the earth gets overly charged, so it has to dissipate that energy back into the ionosphere, back into the solar wind. And it does it with lightning. It leaves from, most of the time, not always, most of the time it leaves from the ground to the cloud, from the cloud to the ionosphere, and things that are called sprites and elves. And they just discovered those about 10 years ago.
Which one is that?
Sprites and the elves.
Only 10 years ago?
Only 10 years. The astronauts have been reporting them. The astronomers were saying, nah, you're seeing things. They finally got some documentation. And now the astronomers have had to say, well, there apparently is a connection in the... We live on an electric planet. We are electric creatures.
It definitely helps to have a key per se, so when you go read these things or look into other things, you're like, oh, that just fits. I know what's going on. But sometimes if you just read the surface thing, you might not know.
The more you understand about this, the more compelling it becomes.
Yeah.
If you just look at the surface, it's intriguing, but it's not very compelling. But if that interest, it's analogous to faith in my worldview. It is faith. The natural curiosity to look beyond the obvious, to follow the breadcrumbs through the forest, to look where the evidence takes you. And if you do that, then what happens is you begin to see it, and it becomes more and more compelling until it becomes undeniable. That's why I can tell people, I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I don't believe it, I know it. Because not only do I have a testimony of it, I've been able to physically confirm the things that he said and understand the things that he had to say. His scriptures that he produced, the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, the Doctrine and Covenants, the temple rituals, all that fits, and it's hugely compelling evidence. And you can argue about issues like women in the priesthood or polygamy or any of the other difficult issues the church faces today. And if that's as far as you've gone in your testimony of Joseph Smith, you're susceptible to that stuff. I don't know the answer to it. I don't have to know the answer, because I've been able to test Joseph Smith on a level that most people never plumb.
Yeah.
And I know he was a prophet.
Well, you definitely got me hooked.
Yeah.
Well, good.
Yeah,
There have been more than one person come to me and say, you know, I was about ready to walk away from the church until I learned what you had to teach. And it's renewed my faith. Thank goodness. That's what I want to have happen. I want every Latter-day Saint to be so committed and so, with this compelling evidence, so committed that they can overlook the stuff that doesn't really make sense. And you say, look, my faith is such that I'm not worried about that.
No.
I'm sorry that other people have issues with it. The gay lesbian crowd, I'm sorry you have trouble in life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and I'm certainly not going to add to your burden. But if you tell me that Joseph Smith was out in the night because he didn't give priesthood to the blacks, or because I'm going to tell you, I know for a certainty that he does know this stuff.
I think it's
Just to let you know, they lock the doors right at 9.
Okay.
Okay.
Time to go.